Chapter 5 starts talking about the Constitution. Pretty much, it's the basis for the government and its structure. Then talks about federalism, the division of political power between central authority and political units, kind of like local government, federal government, that kind of thing. Goes through the application of supremacy clause to state regulation. And then it talks about federal preemption, which is states that in an area which federal regulation is pervasive, state legislation cannot do anything. Talks about separation of powers, which is pretty much the three branches of government and what their job is. Legislative branch really makes laws and enacts them. Executive sees that they are executed, the laws that are executed. Then the judicial branch interprets the laws. Talks about some cases, and then talks about the Commerce Clause, which empowers Congress to regulate commerce with foreign nations, Indian tribes, and amongst the states. Then it talks about the Commerce Clause as a restriction on state authority. It grants authority to regulate commerce to the federal government, and talks about the resolution for conflict. So the courts distinguish between regulations of commerce and regulations under state police power, and police power is defined as the state's retained authority to pass laws to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the community. Talks about taxing and spending powers of the federal government. Talks about the impact of the amendments on business, talks about the Bill of Rights, which is the first 10 amendments, and that it pretty much prohibits federal government from infringing on certain freedoms. Talks about the 14th Amendment, which pretty much applies the entire Bill of Rights to all states. It goes into talking about the First Amendment, which is freedom of speech, press, religion, all that kind of thing. It talks about corporate political speech a little bit. Talks about the Fourth Amendment, which protects the right of individuals to be secure in their persons, homes, and personal property. It basically keeps the government from doing unreasonable searches and seizures of their property, that kind of thing. The Fifth Amendment protects against self-incrimination, double jeopardy, that kind of thing. Talks about due process, provides that no one without due process can be deprived of life, liberty, and property. Talks about the 14th Amendment, which applies the Bill of Rights and the due process clause to the states. Talks about exceptions, which is when the grand jury indictment for certain crimes and the right to jury trials. And then that is chapter 5. And we go into chapter 6, which talks about crime and the criminal procedure. Talks about criminal law, which is punishing offenders for causing harm, regulatory crimes, that kind of thing. It talks about the classification of crime, which is treason, engaging in war against your own country, or giving aid to enemies. Talks about felonies, which means serious crimes punishable by imprisonment or by death. misdemeanors, which are lesser crimes, and then petty crimes, which are minor crimes that are punishable. Talks about criminal procedure, the arrest, probable cause, and Miranda rights. Arrest is just a seizure of, a criminal, or pretty much just to hold someone in a prison kind of thing. Goes through the Miranda rights and that kind of thing, and then it talks about booking and first appearance. Booking is pretty much filing of criminal charges against a criminal. First appearance is the appearance of the defendant before a magistrate who determines whether there was probable cause for the arrest, and then bail, which is the amount of money the defendant pays the court upon release from custody as security that they will return for trial. Goes on to talk about burden of proof, which rests on the prosecutor, and then it talks about important aspects of burden of proof, which is burden of production of evidence. Prosecution must present physical evidence, and the burden of persuasion. The prosecutor needs to convince the jury that the defendant is guilty. It goes on to talk about white-collar crime, which is committed in like businesses, in a professional setting. You're not actually harming someone, you're just doing it, and you're harming a business or harming someone financially. It talks about strict liability offense, no state of mind or intent is required, and that sort of thing. Talks about arguments supporting corporate criminal liability. Fines will pressurize shareholders to ensure that the corporation behaves legally, kind of thing. Investigating a corporation as an entity is easier and more convenient. Talks about how it's unfair to allow shareholders to benefit from illegal activities. And then it talks about arguments against corporate criminal liability, pretty much saying that punishing shareholders is misguided and no real or lasting damage to corporate image can be achieved. And it talks about some cases, and then talks about some factors facilitating commission of white-collar crimes, like groupthink, ease of rationalizing illegal behavior, dispersion of decision-making, and retention of status by persons convicted of white-collar crime. Kind of lists a bunch of them. It talks about sentencing of white-collar crime. It's based on the 1991 sentencing guidelines for use by federal judges. It talks about leniency towards white-collar crimes and how it was a concern. Confinement was really mandated for almost all white-collar offenses. And it talks about criticism, which sentences for white-collar crimes are much less than that of street crimes. It talks about the common white-collar crimes, which is bribery, violations of federal regulations, and criminal fraud. It talks about other crimes, so like larceny, which is secretive and wrongful taking and carrying away of the personal property of another with the intent to permanently deprive that owner of its possession. And then embezzlement. Talks about computer crimes, which less than 1% of these cases are prosecuted. So, it's pretty much just using computers to commit traditional crimes. Keeps going on about computer crimes, destruction of data. Talks about viruses, which pretty much destroys computer data and worm, which travels from one computer to another but does not attach itself to the operating system of the computer. Talks about how to prevent white-collar crimes, so pretty much replacing state with federal chartering, appointing general public directors, link fines to benefits obtained in increasing operating budgets of regulatory agencies, that kind of thing. It goes on to talk about the False Claims Act, which is private citizens may sue employers on behalf of the government for fraud against the government. Talks about the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, which is establishes new rules regarding corporate accounting, government oversight, and financial regulations. And the Whistleblower Protections Act, so it offers protection to federal employees who report illegal government activities.